Two and a Half Admins, episode 241. I'm Joe.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Alan.
And here we are again. And before we get started, your customary article plug, Alan, is ZFS Orchestration Tools, Part 2, Replication.
Yeah, so in Part 1, we kind of provided an overview of all these different ZFS orchestration tools for doing snapshots and so on, comparing their licenses and what's good about each one. So in Part 2, we look specifically at doing ZFS replication and profile some of the best tools, including the one we like the most, Jim's Syncoid.
The one I like the most as well.
Aw.
Well, link in the show notes as usual. The other day, I had a thought, and that thought was, is tech debt inevitable? Now, let me explain. Companies end up accumulating tech debt because they cannot justify paying the upfront cost to not get tech debt because they'll just deal with it later. And even if it's going to cost them more money later, whatever, that's tomorrow's problem. Right now, we can't afford to fix this, so we will just take on the tech debt. And my argument is that capitalism basically makes that inevitable.
It's inevitable regardless. I mean, I don't disagree with you, but I think one of the things that you missed is the idea that tech debt is something that you only took on like at the start. And if you paid more, you could avoid having it. And that's not really how it works. Tech debt accrues. You can do everything the absolute most perfect forward-thinking way possible when you start a project, launch that project with absolutely zero tech debt. Well, guess what? After 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, you got tech debt and you got to pay it because the entire rest of the industry moved on. And if you don't move to keep up with it, you will get left behind. Even if your actual thing doesn't intrinsically need an update of its own, if you expect it to work with the entire rest of the technological human culture, it has to put in the effort to keep up with that culture. And no, there's absolutely no way that you can get around that because everything is going to keep moving and you either keep up with it or you don't.
The most basic thing about tech debt here is it generally accumulates because you don't do something.
Yeah.
Just by existing, you accumulate tech debt.
Mm-hmm.
And either you work to keep it from getting, keep the water level below your neck, or you don't.
Right. But my point is that in a capitalist system, it's inevitable.
I don't think it's even specific to capitalism. Like, if you think about the tech debt you accrue in your home lab at your house, it's just because you don't have time or didn't decide it was worth the time to go and update the firmware on all your Wi-Fi access points or something. It's not even really particular to capitalism. It's just that it takes a bunch of effort, and sometimes you do the calculus and decide it's not worth that effort right now. The thing that makes it so pernicious is that just because you decide you don't need to fix it right now doesn't mean it goes away. And the longer you go without updating, the bigger that jump is going to be, and the more risk there is that something's going to break when you try to update it.
I would largely agree with Alan here. I don't really want to lay this at the feet of capitalism specifically. And the funny thing about that is it's not because I'm a fan of capitalism. It's just that I don't think this is any different from anything else that capitalism might poison. I don't think there's a specific tie between these two things. I would agree if you wanted to posit that capitalism can tend to make this worse because of all of the rather well-known features of capitalism to emphasize short-term gain over long-term stability and, all the other things that we could spend an endless amount of time complaining about. But I don't think there's a special tie between those problems of capitalism and the issue of tech debt. I think tech debt is affected by capitalism the same way anything else is affected by capitalism, but it's still tech debt with or without capitalism and capitalism's problems.
Yeah, it's just capitalism weighs in on that calculus you do to decide, is it worth solving this right now or putting it off? To Joe's point that capitalism can mean putting it off happens more often than maybe it should. But the really tricky thing with tech debt is the longer you put it off, the more expensive it gets, right? It's not linear growth. It's more, maybe not exponential, but it's like interest, right? It keeps growing and growing the longer you let that accrue instead of paying it down.
Compounding.
Yes.
Yeah. It's better if you continually pay down some all the time than if you let it get to the point where, it's up to your eyeballs and then you're trying to pump the water down to make sure that you can still breathe. But you don't have to be like, hey, this is my boat. The sum should be making sure there's never any water in the boat. The water is supposed to stay outside the boat.
Well, another argument for why I think capitalism has got a lot to do with this is there are so many tech companies who sell tech debt as a service. Just look at Ubuntu Pro, for example. Say you've got an LTS version of Ubuntu running on your server, and you know that upgrading that is going to break something. Well, Canonical will happily sell you 12 years of support for that.
I think even half of those people don't even know that it's going to break something. They just don't know it won't break something, so they choose not to take that risk. Most of the times it probably would have been fine, or it might have actually gotten better. But at the same time, I know that my local car dealership was happy to trade my annual service for an old computer so they could keep their Windows 95 based tire alignment machine working instead of having to buy a new one.
I don't know. I'm struggling to find a good way to make that tie that you want between capitalism and tech debt, Joe. I think Alan's example with the ancient Windows 95 machine being kept alive because it's part of a tire system, that gets a little bit closer. I think that capitalism maybe makes it a little bit more likely that you wind up with these orphaned systems, where you've got like, in my world, it's usually more like a $250,000 brake press with, an ancient Windows NT 4.0 workstation controller. And there's no way to upgrade the controller side of it because the company is like, no, you buy a whole new $250,000 brake press and, we'll throw in the $5,000 beige box for free.
And maybe actually, to Joe's point, capitalism might contribute to the fact that a lot of software companies try to iterate faster because they always want to be seeming like they have a newer version of the thing. And sometimes there's a lot of churn that causes tech debt that only exists in order for them to say, hey, we got a new version. Hey, we got a new version all the time.
Yeah.
Or to justify, the old treadmill of buying newer versions of the Microsoft Office suite all the time before they switch to a subscription.
Well, was there anything wrong with Windows 10, for example? Did they need to make Windows 11? Did they need to obsolete everything pre-8th gen Intel, for example? You got hundreds of millions of laptops that are just useless in a few months.
True.
That's an interesting question. I don't have an answer for it exactly, but I did see something recently that was a new one on me. It would appear that Microsoft is definitely using all those TPM chips rather harder in Windows 11 than they had been before. This is just Anecdata and Anecdatum more specifically, mind you. But I had a client last week that they could no longer check their email using Outlook on their laptop. They could log in the browser just fine, and they could check their email in Office 365, but Outlook would just refuse to take their password every single time. And when I investigated it, my first thought was, it's just something screwy in the registry, so let's just, wipe the whole box, reimage. And I did that. So I wiped it and I reimaged it, completely clean, nothing left over, fresh out of the box Windows 11 Pro install, and then downloaded and installed Office 365 on top of it. And guess what? His password still wouldn't work in Outlook. Well, now with a machine with a completely clean software state, brand new registry, nothing else done on it, I'm like, okay, let's look a little bit further. Open up the event log, and I found errors about the TPM module malfunctioning. Every time I would try to log into the client's email using the Outlook application specifically, not in the browser, but using Outlook, if I told it that I wanted to save that password for all users, it would attempt to use the TPM to dump some version of that credential into the Windows vault, and it would fail to do that. And so that event viewer entry was what finally led me to discovering that actually the TPM had gone haywire on this motherboard. And unfortunately, that meant a new laptop for that client because it is a hardware TPM on that box, and it is not a separate one in a module. It's on the board, and it's a laptop. And, if you replace the motherboard in a laptop, you're pretty much replacing the laptop. So now that client bought a whole brand new laptop, and this 2-year-old laptop that the only thing wrong with it is the trusted platform module. The only visible impact is on his ability to read email in Outlook specifically. Now that has gotten demoted to some kind of a weird corner case like presentation laptop because it works for anything but that. So I guess Microsoft was at least serious about wanting to use the TPM for more things.
Now, I do wonder if the TPM went haywire because it's been written too many times. I assume they're Flash and probably not especially high endurance Flash.
I do not know. Like I said, this whole experience was a new one on me and a particularly frustrating one. It really, really sucks having to explain to somebody that their only 2-year-old, very high-end, precision mobile workstation laptop, which unfortunately only had a 1-year warranty on it, it visibly works. Like, it's a really nice laptop, but you can't check your email on it now using the program that you want to because Microsoft decided for some freaking reason to tie that in with the TPM and also not build in any decent error trapping around it. Like, it would have been really nice if instead of just saying that's the wrong password, it had said, there's a TPM issue here.
I failed to save your credentials to the secure module on your laptop because it's broken. Instead, it's just like, that's not the right password. It's like, but it was the right password and you just couldn't save it.
Exactly.
And why isn't there a toggle somewhere to say, okay, let's have slightly less good security and make this thing work?
I had hoped that just disabling the TPM in BIOS would make that work, but no such luck.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by SysCloud. Companies big and small rely a lot on SaaS applications to run their businesses. But what happens when critical SaaS data is lost due to human errors, accidental deletions, or ransomware attacks? That's where SysCloud comes in. It's a single pane of glass to back up all critical SaaS applications, such as Microsoft 365, Google Workspace, Salesforce, Slack, HubSpot, QuickBooks Online, to name a few. SysCloud also helps with ransomware recovery, identifies compliance gaps in your SaaS data, monitors for unusual data activity, and can automatically archive inactive SaaS data to save on storage costs. Plus, it's SOC 2 certified, so data remains secure in the cloud. Over 2,000 IT admins already trust SysCloud to protect their SaaS data. Head to syscloud.com for a 30-day free trial, and for a limited time, use code 25admins to get 50% off your first purchase. That's syscloud.com. Let's do some feedback then. Chris writes, Joe, I would very much like to hear more about how you went about planning and reorganizing your NAS's ZFS pool. I've made the same mistakes in setting up my NAS. Dumped files into the root, didn't set up datasets, etc. And I am not sure how to get out of this corner into which I've painted myself. I think there are people who can learn and gain confidence from your experience. Well, Chris, don't do what I did. I just manually copied stuff and spent hours and hours and hours doing it.
Yeah, so what we only told Joe after the fact, when we heard of what he had done, was if you're using at least OpenZFS 2.2 or newer, there's the block reference tree or file cloning feature. And that would let you clone all the files from your root into the data sets where you want them without taking up a lot of extra space. It'll just take up a little bit of metadata. Then you can delete the files from the copy in the root, and it will erase them from the block reference tree table, so it won't take up any extra room and RAM either. So basically, temporarily, you'll be duplicating the files, but using ZFS file cloning so that you're not actually using up any extra space, and it will be much quicker than you having to do what Joe did, which is actually copy all the data and write it out again, and then be able to clean that up. And you can reorganize all your files into datasets without the same cost that Joe had. The downside to all that is, you won't be able to preserve your snapshots in the same way. And so it's up to you to decide if it's worth moving all your files to datasets and making new snapshots versus still having your old snapshots.
I think the first thing you've got to do is you've got to decide how many datasets do you want, roughly how big are they going to be, and what's going in what. How are you going to organize this? And that's only something that you can decide based on your data. And I ended up with 14 datasets, some of them bigger than I would like, to be honest.
Yeah, like when I set up mine, my rule of thumb at the time was to make sure any one data set wasn't bigger than 0.5 terabyte, based on my experience of trying to move my NAS from a RAID Z1 of 4 3 terabyte hard drives to 6 drives of a bigger size and so on. Nowadays, I'd probably say even up to 1 terabyte is probably fine. It kind of depends. Maybe it's better to base on percent of your pool. Don't let any one data set be more than 10% of your pool, and you'll have a lot more flexibility. But also, what I learned from using it at work is that if there are files you're going to want to delete and not keep snapshots of, make sure those are in a different data set than the files you're going to want to keep snapshots of. So at work, that meant every customer has their own separate data set. So when they stop paying us money, we delete all their files and all their snapshots without affecting the snapshots for the other customers that are still paying us. But at home, that could mean if you have a download folder or anything that's more ephemeral, having that be a separate data set so the snapshots of it are short-lived, or you can exclude it from your backups if you're using Sanoid. You can say, yeah, don't replicate my downloads to the other machine, only the stuff that I've actually put into different places. Or, I sorted my TV shows by genre to get them broken down into more reasonable sizes without having to make a separate data set for every show or something like that.
Yeah, I don't spend a lot of time worrying about the size of an individual data set. I've kind of moved beyond like the Joe level concern of like, oh, it's difficult to move my things around on like this one box I have. Like there's always capacity one way or another in my world. So I don't really concern myself with that too much. My big concern is with a functional delineation, where if you've got like a different function, that's where I'm generally looking at splitting things up by data set. Now, the most obvious and direct is like, oh, if I want to roll this back independently of another thing, well, then obviously it needs to be in its own data set. But I'm usually not getting all the way down to that level so much as just thinking about the functionality first. And that way, when I want to do the individual rollback later, it's already there. So like, for example, I do a lot of virtual machine hosting. And my virtual machine hosts, they'll usually have a pool named data, and they'll have a data set named images. And then beneath images, there is a separate data set for every virtual machine. And for virtual machines that have more than one drive, they usually have more than one data set so that each virtual drive is in its own data set. Because, for example, I might be hosting let's say a Windows Server 2022, and it's got several terabytes of bulk files on it. It's serving as a file server for a client. Well, that Windows Server is going to have one data set for its C drive and a separate data set for its D drive, which is where all the data is shared from. And that's so that in the event of a Windows update going horribly wrong, I have the option of rolling back the operating system of the virtual machine without affecting the data. Or vice versa. Maybe I don't want to roll back, operating system upgrades and whatever that have taken place, but maybe there was a malicious employee or a ransomware attack or whatever, and I need to roll back the data, but I don't need to mess with the operating system. So you can kind of see where I'm going there. That's where I'm looking at, different places to put things in a different data set. Home directories, home itself, data set. Each user under home, its own data set. If I've got a MySQL database on a machine, well, that's definitely going to be its own data set that's created, under var MySQL, wherever your distribution happens to put it. I'm going to want a database just for that database binary. And part of the reason I want that is not only for purposes of rollback, but also so I can tune that independently, because the proper record size tuning for a database binary is very different from the proper record size tuning for example, a data set that you're serving bulk file storage across the network from.
Yeah. The reason why ZFS has so many data sets is because, or allows you to have many data sets, is because you can have different policies, whether that's what somebody's allowed to take snapshots of or do replication of, or what's included in the replication, or like Jim said, settings like compression and the record size, where you might want to be able to control it different, or even just the caching. So yeah, like Jim said, anything functional where you're going to maybe want to have different rules and policies about what happens on that data set, or how that data set gets written, or cached, or whatever, then that's another good reason to have data sets.
And you don't necessarily have to know what that different policy will be right now. You just need to recognize, there may come a time that I would like to have a different policy with this grouping of data. And if you recognize that possibility as, relatively likely, then you should probably put that data in its own data set.
Can we just return to block cloning briefly? Say you've got a bunch of data sets, and then you've also got a bunch of files and directories in the root of the pool. How many files and directories can you do at a time? How scriptable is it, sort of thing? I'm not going to have to do this for every directory, am I? Or what's involved with it?
It's just a brute force copy, Joe. From your perspective, it's the same as a brute force copy. You're just using the CP command. It works the same way. It's just whether BRT is enabled on your system or not, and you'll want to check that. One of the easiest ways to check it is just try to copy a file that's, say, 2 or 3 gigs. And if that copy completes in 100 milliseconds, guess what? You've got BRT enabled. If it takes, the full 20 or 30 seconds that you would expect out of, whatever underlying hardware you've got, then no, you do not have BRT enabled.
In particular, if you use CP with you can do -f reflinks equals always, then it will fail if it doesn't use block cloning, and that will let you know for sure that it was doing block cloning. rsync by default will not do this for you. So you do actually have to use the CP command, or something that actually understands reflinks.
So you're telling me that if I had just upgraded to 2404, upgraded my pool, and then used CP, it would have taken me minutes instead of hours.
Possibly. It depends on what the actual workload was. BRT isn't going to accelerate copies of small files much, if any at all. Very large files, it's a huge benefit on, but it's still not as quick as like taking a snapshot is, for example. You do still definitely have some experienced time elapsing when you're copying like a really large file. That example of a couple of gigs taking, 1 or 200 milliseconds, like that's pretty on point. That's the level of speed you can generally expect. I have seen an individual file take as long as 3 or 4 full human seconds to copy while using BRT. It's just that same copy operation probably would have taken an hour and a half without it.
Yeah, because one of the directories that I had to move was my old Windows ISOs, just a collection of actual genuine Windows ISOs from like just old XP shit, just that I should delete, but I just hoard.
Mm-hmm.
And so we are talking about reasonably big files here that took, half an hour to copy, but that was massive, relatively big files. So it would have been much, much quicker to do it this way.
Yes, absolutely. Where you would have been looking at like, a CD-ROM size ISO, 600 to 700 megabytes, you might expect that to copy on reasonably fast infrastructure, say consumer, solid state drives. You might expect that to copy in, say 4 or 5 seconds, one of those ISOs. You'd expect the same copy to take place in, somewhere between 50 and a couple of hundred milliseconds using BRT.
Yeah, this was just spinning Rust to spinning Rust. So
Right. But even that, so yeah, again, you're talking probably 10 to 20 times faster.
Yeah. The slower your drives and the larger your files, the bigger an improvement you're going to see.
Yeah. The caveat is, while both copies of that exist, BRT takes a little bit of RAM for each block that it's cloned. But because you're going to just delete the first copy and go down to having one copy and it doesn't take any RAM to do that, means that there's no long-term effect. It's just while you have both copies, it will take, a couple of bytes of RAM for each block.
Doesn't that also presume that he destroys all snapshots that have the original copy of the file in them?
Yes.
Yeah. So in practice, that may be a bit difficult.
Well, you don't have to destroy the snapshots on the root. If you're making the root empty after, yes. But that's what I was referring to in Chris's original question of if you're okay with having to remake snapshots, basically, after you do the cloning, then you can get everything out of the root.
Yeah. Now, the last thing, addressing the elephant in the room that we've all been ignoring, is that I'm laughing, I'm smiling. You can't see it, listeners, but I am laughing and smiling. You shouldn't need to be that concerned about all this because you have backup anyway, right? And if you have full backup, reorganization isn't painful because you've got a whole extra copy of everything. You can just delete all of it and copy it all back in if you need to, right?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Even if he had a full copy on his backup server, he could have just renamed the dataset on his backup server around to where he wanted it and then received it back on his primary.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by people who support us with PayPal and Patreon. Go to 2.5admins.com/support for details of how you can support us too. Patreon supporters have the option to listen to episodes without ads like this. And it's not just this show. There's Late Night Linux for news, discoveries, audience input, and misanthropy. Linux Matters for upbeat family-friendly adventures. Linux After Dark for silly challenges and philosophical debates. Linux Dev Time about developing with and for Linux. Hybrid Cloud Show for everything public and private cloud. And Ask the Hosts for off-topic questions from you. You can even get some episodes a bit early. We've got a lot going on, and it's only possible because of the people who support us. So if you like what we do and can afford it, it would be great if you could support us too at 2.5admins.com/support. Let's do some free consulting then. But first, just a quick thank you to everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. And if you want to send in your questions for Jim and Alan or your feedback, you can email show@2.5admins.com. Yoel writes, how do you go about managing Linux updates as an MSSP? Our Linux environment is either Ubuntu or Debian. As an MSSP, we are responsible for patching OS-related vulnerabilities and updates. Any vulnerabilities found on other applications the client has installed, they are responsible for it because we do not want to break any configuration change the update may cause. Is there a way of identifying and upgrading only OS-related packages? How would you handle it if you were an MSSP? Whether it is certain tools that you'd use or even communicating with the client, any advice is highly appreciated.
Well, so first of all, we should clarify that MSSP is a Managed Security Service Provider, because that acronym may not be, or I should say that initialism may not be immediately familiar to all of our listeners. For the specific use case being talked about here, the only reasonable way to do it, as far as I'm concerned, is you have to run your own update server. Now, you don't necessarily have to run the entire repository from your own server. You can position, your repo as a third-party repo and simply pin the importance of your repo versus the system repo, so that anything in your repos will automatically take precedence over anything in the upstream original system repositories. Now, beyond that, as to identify which packages you specifically want to patch yourselves and harden, that's a whole different topic, and I don't think we can get very far with that in 5 minutes.
That's an interesting one, looking at the different way FreeBSD does it, where the operating system packages are separate from the third-party packages. And so what is FreeBSD used to not even be packages at all, but with version 15, we have the concept of package base, and it will be packages, but it is its own separate repo that you could have your own version of. So I think what Jim suggested there is probably the best, of basically have your own apt repo that is basically upstream Ubuntu, but with your patches and whatever you want, but keep that repo to the bare minimum, just the packages you support and nothing else. And then does apt let you, when you run apt upgrade, say only do stuff out of this one repo?
I'm not aware of anything in the apt command that can allow you to only check one server or another. Usually when you're managing packages like this, the big thing that you're doing where you might be fulfilling one package out of multiple repos is there's a concept of pinning. You can pin a particular repository for a particular package as being higher priority, so that that's the one that gets used. I believe you can change the overall precedence of a repository to begin with. I'm not 100% on that one, but I believe you can say, okay, if the package exists on this repo, then this is a higher priority than the other one, but I might be off on that one. It might just be the package specific pinning.
Yeah, and then it comes down to having to be careful about ABIs, right? Like if one of the things in your MSSP patched repo is OpenSSL, if you make any change that makes it not binary compatible, then if you update the OpenSSL package and they've installed some app that uses OpenSSL and it's expecting the other version, it's going to have a problem. But looking at regular Ubuntu or Debian, all of those are going to be built against, one version of OpenSSL. They're not going to have a mix of 3.0 and 3.1 or something where there's going to be an ABI problem. But it is the type of thing you have to watch out for when you start, having more than one source of truth for packages, is to make sure that everything is still going to be compatible, but updating just the packages that are under the coverage of your MSSP agreement. So as far as certain tools, I think you want to avoid going much outside of apt, because you don't want to require the customer to install any more tools than necessary. And then communicating, that's mostly about setting expectations and documentation. If they're going to be installing other things that want to, if they suddenly want to switch to the Ubuntu hardware enablement kernel that's completely different, that might have a big impact on what you're doing. So you might want to make sure they don't do that without telling you or something, because that could really throw a wrench in things. But yeah, I think the big thing is you want to tell them before. You say, hey, on Friday, we're going to run this update on your system, so they know that that's going to happen, and tell them once it's done so that if they see anything weird after that, they know to reach out to you and say, hey, we're seeing this incompatibility or something. But I think other than communicating frequently and clearly, I don't have any other specific recommendations there.
I do. If you're an MSSP and your value add is supposed to be that you're securing the client systems above and beyond what they would be without you, well, then one of your big client communication goals becomes communicating to your client how you are actually providing them value. And doing that on a regular basis can be the difference between keeping a contract and losing it. So if you're patching a wide array of system libraries that, then you're placing on this apt repo server that we've hypothetically created, you want to maybe, put out a newsletter, every week or every month talking about, some of the big patches that you've applied, that, things that got into your repos before they made it out into the major distribution repositories. If there's a really widespread attack that happens and, your clients aren't vulnerable to it because of you having patched them prior to it, maybe send out a little, pat myself on the backgram and let them know, oh, hey, this thing you might have seen in the news, you didn't need to worry about it because we had this patched before, yada, 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 et cetera. In general, a lot of your client communication, especially for any kind of recurring service, like managed service provision at all, much less security service, it's going to come down to you really want to remind your client fairly frequently why it is that they're giving you money and why it would be a good idea for them to keep giving you money.
Right, well, we better get out of here then. Remember, show@2.5admins.com if you want to send in your questions or your feedback. You can find me at joelrest.com/mastodon.
You can find me at mercenarysysadmin.com.
And I'm at Alan Jude.
We'll see you next week.